Hi there and welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Kapelos in Ottawa on this Wednesday. Tonight, White House win or flop?
As the president said yesterday, the Prime Minister of Canada is a tough negotiator. We will get a great deal.
This is the tough negotiator that we hired? The guy who broke his promise to have a deal on July 21st.
The Prime Minister is back from D.C. with no agreement to announce yet following his second Oval Office sit-down with President Donald Trump. We're going to have the latest reaction on Parliament Hill. Plus, we're set to break it all down with our front bench. Sharon Carr, Kevin Deagle, Jamie Ellerton and Sebastian Scampsey will be here a little bit later on. And BC's side of a pipeline fight.
He began it, and I hope he dials his rhetoric back.
British Columbia Premier David Eby will join us in moments to respond to Danielle Smith calling his comments on a potential pipeline from Alberta to BC's coast un-Canadian. That's coming up. Plus, Keystone bargaining chip.
Investors built pipelines. It's only been since the Liberals have been in power that taxpayers have had to subsidize pipeline projects.
Is the Carney government pushing the currently defunct Keystone XL pipeline expansion, long supported by Canadian governments, as a carrot in a deal with Donald Trump? Conservative House Leader Andrew Scheer says his party wants to see it built, but slams any suggestion of public money to do it. The Conservatives House Leader will join me in studio a little bit later on in the program. First, though,
We'll go soft on him today because I know he's still recovering from surgery to have his elbows removed. Remember that promise, Mr. Speaker? Dancing around with his elbows in the air. We haven't seen those elbows since the election.
Our relationship with the United States would never again be what it was. Secondly, thing that is true is we have the best deal with the Americans. And the third thing that's true is we will get an even better deal.
The Prime Minister went pathetically to the White House to offer a $1 trillion gift, bowing before the president in weakness.
I would like to inform the Leader of the Opposition that there is a thing called the private sector. The private sector makes decisions about investment.
that is what it sounded like in the House of Commons following, as you saw there, the return of Prime Minister Mark Carney from a few-day trip, a couple of days in Washington to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump. Both leaders described the meeting and what occurred during that trip as positive and optimistic, and that there is momentum. But at the end of the day, the Prime Minister did not return with any kind of tangible deal in hand. My colleague, our senior political correspondent here at CTV News, Mike LeCouture, was alongside for that trip, covering what went down between the Prime Minister and the President. Let's start on that, main political flashpoint,
right,
which is, what exactly did you come back with? Explain to us a little bit about what happened during the trip and why there isn't actually like a, here's what's going to happen to sectoral tariffs, et cetera.
Yeah, and maybe we go back to what the idea was going into the trip, right? Was that there could be some sort of relief on sectoral tariffs, specifically steel, and that is what we had thought we were going to be getting, the possibility of some sort of a movement. And of course, there were a lot of sort of adjectives to sort of downplay a lot of things, Vashi, and that's kind of where it was going. But certainly the thought of having some sort of a deal out of this was in the cards. But then, of course, we hear from Dominic LeBlanc following all of this, and he's the minister in charge of Canada-U.S. trade. And he said, look, this is what we have now is basically a promise to continue working and to work a little harder, essentially. He's staying back in D.C. for the coming days, is what we're hearing from his team, to continue to do this work, to try and make any kind of headway, specifically in the sectors of steel, aluminum, and energy. And I think energy is key here because that's where the Keystone XL pipeline comes in, and that's what we're hearing again today. Sources telling CTV News that that was put on the table inside the Oval Office, and this is something that they are basically saying to Donald Trump, is this something that you would be interested in? And that is how it's really being sort of framed for us. But you also had this morning, you had Anita Anand meeting with her counterpart, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and certainly they didn't come back with any deliverable, but Dominic LeBlanc was trying to really frame this as, no, we're going to be doing the hard work now to try and get to some sort of relief in those sectors.
The Keystone stuff is very interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, that is something governments of all political stripes in Canada have already supported. It's actually the U.S. that had the issue, both at a state level, those permits have now lapsed, but also at the federal level when you had Trump saying yes to it and both President Biden and President Obama effectively killing what presidential permits ever existed or not issuing them in the first place. The other interesting part to me is that it is being brought up in the context of a reduction in tariffs on steel and aluminum and potentially something in and around energy. The word that isn't in there is autos. And Howard Lutnick, the point person for the White House, you were in the same room as him yesterday on this file, spoke before this conference that's taking place in Toronto, this summit BMO and Eurasia Group put on. And it was Chatham House rules, meaning you're not supposed to talk about what was said.
Right.
3 people called me after because the comments were so specific and news generating to say that he basically insinuated that an auto deal was just off the table, that the auto sector, they are dead set on pursuing, more manufacturing going to America. They don't want to buy Canadian cars. Canada should always come in second. Maybe, he said in this talk, he would buy, Americans would buy some Canadian car parts. But the impression left on the audience was like, there is not a deal to be had with autos. And that made its way to question period as well. I'm going to play that clip and then get your feedback. Let's listen in.
That is why we are fighting hard for our auto workers, and I put the president on notice yesterday about the consequences of not having that accord.
Mr. President, you have been warned. If you put in another tariff, he's going to give you yet another $1 trillion. This is the tough negotiator that we hired?
Our auto sector is paying less than 10% tariff. When Japan, when Europe, when the UK, when the rest of the world is paying 15, which is bigger than 10.
He is already signing a deal that makes us worse off because he makes concession after concession after concession while getting nothing in return.
So interestingly, because of those comments today from Howard Lutnick, Mike, like this became, again, a very specific flashpoint, rather, a political flashpoint in the House of Commons. Premier Ford was in the room for that. He said at the end of his remarks, like, what's the Prime Minister going to do about this? It looks like autos is going to remain very unresolved.
Well, especially yesterday when you consider that that was very contentious in the room as well. When he said, Donald Trump said, we are in a natural business conflict with Canada because we both want to make the same things, instead specifically on autos. And then he said, we don't want to buy cars from Canada, and Americans don't want that either. He even invoked Angela Merkel in a meeting he had with her and said, how many American cars are being sold in Germany? And he claims that she said none. But Howard Lutnick also spoke up in the Oval Office yesterday specifically on that. And he really underlined how they want to keep their auto industry in the U.S. and they don't want to share is essentially what it comes down to. Because right now we know there are auto parts that cross the border 6 or 7 times before they go in a car in North America, and they are, CUSMA compliant. And we did hear from Doug Ford, the Ontario Premier, today say that, look, the Auto Pact has been around since the 1960s. And the way he put it is you can't unscramble an omelet, you just add more eggs to it and you really expand on it. And that's what he wants here. Whether or not he's going to get that, it doesn't seem like that.
Does not feel like
this
it right
really
now.
seems like this is going to be the hill that the Americans want to die on with autos. And they want to make sure, because Trump has always said he wants to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. And where has it been moving away from? Well, when some of these auto parts have been moving to either Mexico or Canada, even though it is part of the Auto Pact or CUSMA, that is not his voting base. And certainly Donald Trump would love to see it as a win for him to bring back any amount of auto manufacturing, because that is that sort of core manufacturing sector that he wants those votes from.
Ironically, auto companies, if you look at their quarterly profits, have taken a massive hit thanks to these tariffs. But hey, why let facts get in the way of anything? Thanks so much, Mike. Appreciate your reporting.
Passion. That's
our senior political correspondent, Michael Couture. Our front bench is set to talk about this, as well as Conservative House Leader Andrew Scheer, who will join me live in studio in a few moments. Right now, though, I want to turn to a different but equally significant and developing story. There's a battle brewing in Western Canada that feels like it's almost at a fever pitch. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith wants a new bitumen pipeline to BC's coast, but BC's Premier says no way nor how. Here's Premier Smith on this program last night.
He began it, and I hope he dials his rhetoric back, because I'll be very frank about what I think of premiers who are trying to block other premiers from getting their products to market. So I would say that I think he went a little bit far yesterday. I hope he's regretting it. I know he's been ratioed quite badly on his video, which is a suggestion to me that he's not expressing the views of British Columbians.
That's Alberta's Premier on this program. Last night, tonight, we are joined by British Columbia Premier David Eby, who is with us live, I believe, close to the legislature or maybe inside it. Premier, a pleasure to have you back on the program. Thank you for making the time.
Thanks for having me. I'm right here in the basement of the BC legislature right now.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks for carving out some time for this. Look, I've listened to your comments over the past number of days very closely, and I wanted to start off by asking you why you are so upset about something that you yourself have said is not, quote, real, non-existent, and fictional.
Yeah, thanks. And it's an important explanation, and it's a nuance that gets lost in the headlines. The proposal from Alberta for a pipeline across the north, it implicates directly a ban on oil tankers off our north coast. That is conditioned precedent. It's a requirement of coastal First Nations to support major projects that we're advancing here in British Columbia that are worth tens of billions of dollars to the Canadian economy, not just in construction, but in operation as well. LNG Canada Phase 1 was the largest private sector investment in Canadian history. They're currently considering Phase 2. That project requires the goodwill of coastal First Nations, and they support it because the tanker ban's in place. So what I've got right now is a minister from Alberta calling up these coastal First Nations saying, hey, we want to build a heavy oil pipeline right to your coast that you see as an existential threat to your way of life. And hey, what do you guys think about that? But the project doesn't actually exist, and it won't exist. There's no private sector proponent that is advancing it, unless the federal and provincial government of Alberta pony up tens of billions of public dollars. So what we have is a publicly funded, massive project that is threatening privately funded, massive projects that are going to pay for public projects across Canada. I find that very aggravating, that we have tens of thousands of jobs for Canadians from coast to coast to coast. That's who worked on the first phase of LNG Canada Phase 1, that are being put at risk by, frankly, what is political posturing out of Alberta.
But you yourself are saying that it's a fantasy project, that it is not in any way backed by a private proponent. You have gone to great length to say that it is essentially fake. So I don't understand. I get what you're saying about the prospect of this being raised, but like inherently, is that so wrong of the minister? If this is something they'd like to see go ahead, why not call up and do some consultation in advance? Like, why are you fanning the flames of this if there is nothing real to talk about in your estimation? And is it because it is politically popular with a constituency of NDP supporters that you need to support you in your leadership review?
Well, look, there has been a lot of discussion about resource development in our province, including LNG and other major resource projects. And we are advancing those projects. We're having hard conversations with a lot of British Columbians that are concerned about the impacts of fossil fuel infrastructure and so on. But we've got to grow our economy provincially and nationally. And to be blunt, if we don't do these projects, Donald Trump's going to put a giant plant in Alaska and sell to the same markets anyway. So let's lift up Indigenous people. Let's give people trades training. Let's deliver low carbon LNG to the world. We have a fragile coalition in the north to deliver these projects. And that coalition is directly threatened by ham-handed efforts by Alberta, because they're not saying this may or may not happen. We're not sure. It requires tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer funding. They're not saying any of that. They're saying we've got a proponent. We're delivering the project. It's going to happen. That's what they're saying in these phone calls to nations. And so then I've got to go clean up that mess and try to hold everybody together to actually deliver real projects that are going to pay for infrastructure across Canada, that are going to employ people from across Canada in the trades. When I was up at LNG Phase 1 in Kitimat, I met workers from every corner of this country that were working on it. And so, that's what's on the line here. It's not a trivial matter. This is a really big deal for British Columbians and for Canadians. And to have the Premier of Alberta say, well, unless this pipeline goes ahead, we're looking at leaving the country. I mean, look, I would like tens of billions of dollars of federal funding for projects in British Columbia. I'll show you what we can do. But we're doing projects without tens of billions of dollars in federal funding. And I don't see why Alberta would leave the country if they didn't get that.
With all due respect, just two quick things. I've interviewed the Prime Minister now, pardon me, the Premier on two separate occasions just on this announcement. She has said that it would mean Canada doesn't work. She did not ever say that she would leave the country. She said she would end up shipping more oil to the United States, which is the opposite of the objective that premiers in the aggregate and the Prime Minister have expressed about weaning ourselves off of U.S. dependence. I would also just put to you, like, why do you reflexively reject the economic, the sort of growth generating prospects of a bitumen pipeline and look at TMX, right? I understand your criticism of there being taxpayer dollars behind that, but just in this first operational year alone, that pipeline has created an additional $2 billion of revenue for federal coffers. That money goes to British Columbia, it goes to Nova Scotia, it goes to Newfoundland and Ontario. Like, why reflexively say that a pipeline to your coast would not be as growth generating as the projects that you cite around LNG? Like, why is it okay for you to exploit LNG and not for Alberta to exploit oil?
Because I'm not asking for any federal money to do it. This is a major private sector project that is supported by private industry. In fact, a coalition of countries that we're trying to expand our trade with. That is going to fund tax revenues for people across Canada to do the things that we want to do as a nation. We have a publicly funded pipeline already. The TMX pipeline costs taxpayers north of $30 billion. It is not a capacity. There is an optimization project that's available that could significantly increase the capacity on that pipeline. But we're not talking about that with Alberta. And it's not because we don't want to. In fact, we've raised it repeatedly with Alberta. We've talked to them about tying in our electricity to Alberta to help them reduce their emissions from the oil sands, making their products more saleable internationally, and reducing costs for Albertans in terms of their electricity bills. We've talked with them about working on hydrogen, where we get unified standards with the federal government and get hydrogen out to the ports, to world markets as well. These are real projects with proponents and support that will generate benefits for Albertans and Canadians. And instead of talking about any of that, we're talking about this non-existent pipeline project across the north, and in the process, threatening tens of billions of dollars of further real projects in British Columbia. BC has massive private sector projects that will lift up our economy from coast to coast, and we're keen to develop them and deliver them. 40% of the major projects on the Prime Minister's list are BC projects, and it could have been the entire list. But you know, all I'm asking for is a little bit of support from our neighbor to understand the fragile coalition we have that we're trying to build to do these things that we have to do because of many court decisions and our recognition of inherent Indigenous rights. And we have to work within that framework. And to just show up and be ham-handed all over the place, we're going to build this heavy oil pipeline through and create confusion and chaos when we need to be growing our economy with real projects. It doesn't make any sense.
But again, Premier, she hasn't done exactly what you're saying. Like, you're misrepresenting it. For example, I have pushed her on both of the interviews that I did on the prospect of public money, and she outright says, like, public money backing this pipeline would be a bad thing. That the endeavor that she has embarked on is to secure a private proponent, not for more taxpayer money to go towards this. She said that repeatedly about TMX as well. She agrees with you on that. But I guess what I just don't understand is, why don't you want to embark on a conversation like the other ones you talked about how something like this could potentially be possible? What are the things that need to be addressed? Like, is there not a conversation to be had, given the crisis we face from the United States, that one pipeline to your coast already adds 0.5% to our GDP on an annual basis? Like, isn't that worth sitting down rather than reflexively saying, no way, no how, this isn't Danielle Smith's world?
Well, I mean, with respect, that's not what I'm saying. I am saying that there is no private sector proponent. If public money on this pipeline is a bad thing, then what are we doing? This is a crown corporation set up by Alberta, fully funded by Alberta taxpayers, backed by the corporation that is publicly owned that runs the Trans Mountain Pipeline. There's nothing but public money in this project. And there is no prospect of private money because we have a pipeline for sale as Canadians. It's $30 billion. Does anyone want to buy it? Silence. Nobody is buying the TMX pipeline. And so if the economics are not making sense for the private sector, but there are projects that do make sense for the private sector that are bringing in, like LNG Canada Phase 2 is going to be the largest, again, private sector investment in the history of Canada. And that is one of the projects that is put at risk by what the Premier of Alberta is doing. And if the goal is to get her product to Tidewater, then the bizarre part that I cannot understand is why are we not using our existing publicly funded pipeline that already delivered $30 billion of benefits to Alberta, funded by taxpayers from across Canada, using that pipeline, optimizing it, filling it up, and using it to its full capacity to generate profits for Canadians in the immediate term. Like, this is a short-term project that we could do together, but that's not where the conversation is. And it, frankly, it has been imperiled by this other conversation and challenges now to our relationship with Alberta that I've really been trying to avoid. We've been trying to work constructively with Alberta, but I can't stand by while they threaten projects that we have that are in the hopper, that are ready to go, where final investment decision is pending. I mean, this is a big deal for us and for Canadians.
Why can't both things happen at the same time? Why can't you develop LNG to the benefit of British Columbians and Canada more largely, just in the same way? Even if you optimize TMX, the point the Premier is making is there's such demand, in particular from Asia, that a second pipeline could be supported, could further decrease the differential, which again greatly increases the revenues to the federal coffers as well. Like, why can't both things happen at the same time? And do you know for a fact that any of the projects you're talking about are in peril now, just at the prospect of this fake thing, as you call it, being talked about?
I know that I have had calls from coastal First Nations saying, we're getting outreach from Alberta about this project. What is happening? If this goes ahead, we're going to have to reevaluate our support for these other projects, the expansion, the significant multi-billion-dollar expansion of our port at Prince Rupert that supports the export of goods from across Canada, the LNG projects, including Indigenous-owned projects across the north. Because, but you have to understand, for these nations, the threat of a major oil spill is existential for them. Like, this is like it's a zero compromise position that they are in. They're like, we can support these other things. We support economic development. We get our role. But we've lived here for a long time, and an oil spill would threaten our entire existence. And so if you're going to engage in that conversation with those nations, you better have a real project. It better be well advanced. It better be more than just an idea that somebody's had that's going to require tens of billions of dollars of federal taxpayer dollars to deliver. And there better be no alternatives. But in fact, there are alternatives. And instead of exploring those alternatives, we're doing something else. And I've got to ask why that is. Why is it that is the priority for the government of Alberta, instead of the pipeline that's already publicly owned that we could well advance? And that's why these things, they can't go at the same time. We need to ensure that we're delivering major projects in the short term for this country and our economy. We have an additional 10% tariff on our lumber industry, which means that BC lumber and Canadian lumber has less access to the American market than Russia does. And it is threatening the existence of our timber industry. People in rural communities need jobs and employment now, not 5, 7 years, 10 years down the road, funded by tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars. They need those big private sector projects, and we can deliver them, and we will deliver them in BC in a way that lifts the whole country up. But I can't have it that the Premier of Alberta, for political reasons, is advancing this over at the expense of British Columbians and Canadians.
Okay, I'm out of time, Premier. I appreciate you making the time for the conversation, as always. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot. David Eby is the Premier of British Columbia. We're going to take a quick break. The Keystone XL pipeline is back in the headlines. The Carney government is pitching support for it as a way to garner reductions in U.S. tariffs on aluminum and steel. The Conservatives say they'd support a Keystone revival. But is there a but? Find out when Conservative House Leader Andrew Scheer joins us in studio after a very short commercial break.
That is why we are fighting hard for our auto workers. And I put the president on notice yesterday about the consequences of not having that accord.
Mr. President, you have been warned. If you put in another tariff, he's going to give you yet another $1 trillion. This is the tough negotiator that we hired?
Our auto sector is paying less than 10% tariff. When Japan, when Europe, when the UK, when the rest of the world is paying 15, which is bigger than 10.
He is already signing a deal that makes us worse off because he makes concession after concession after concession while getting nothing in return.
Debate in the House of Commons there a little earlier today. Prime Minister Mark Carney is back in Ottawa after a trip to Washington that both he and President Trump described in positive terms. Good vibes aside, though, the Prime Minister didn't come back and make an announcement about a deal on either sectoral tariffs or anything broader. While the feds insist progress is being made, sources tell CTV News that U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick dismissed any prospect of an auto deal with Canada, telling an audience at a summit in Toronto that the U.S. could continue buying parts from Canada, but that's about it. Sources also tell us Keystone XL was raised during yesterday's meeting, but they described it as a, quote, very initial conversation. Conservative House Leader Andrew Scheer is here with me now. Mr. Scheer, it's good to have you in studio. I appreciate you making the time. I know that you expressed support for Keystone. I want to get to that in a second, not exactly as the government lays it out, but I actually wanted to start where I left off with Premier Eby, because the other hot topic in this country right now is a pipeline that doesn't just go north-south, but out west from Alberta. He is vehemently opposed. I know that, we can all debate the reasons behind that, but it's a fact right now that he really doesn't want that pipeline to be built. Would a Conservative government kind of try to build it anyway?
Well, that's what happened with TMX. The British Columbia government, the NDP government, didn't support TMX, but we have a constitution in Canada that empowers the federal government to make these kinds of decisions to the benefit of all Canadians. The Conservative Party has been proudly championing a pipeline that would open up Asian markets. Right now, Canada sells at a discount to the United States. The U.S. economy is basically subsidized by the Canadian energy sector, and we believe a great way to change that is to get a pipeline to the Western shores that open up markets like India and Korea and Japan.
The point that Premier Eby was making, though, is an interesting one around the tanker ban, which effectively kills any kind of pipeline to the Northwest coast, but that the variety of deals he's been able to make with the private sector and Indigenous groups to generate more LNG development has been predicated on the existence of that tanker ban. So would a Conservative government run roughshod over that, for example? Like, are you willing to sacrifice LNG for oil?
I believe it was Christy Clark, former British Columbia Premier, it might have been even on this show, that pointed out— I was
away that day, but yeah.
Okay, well she pointed out it's really just a ban on Canadian shipping. That the law the Liberals put in place really just prevents Canadian energy from getting to other markets. American shipping goes up and down the coast. I believe she said every day. So
not in the same proximity.
Well,
there is a difference.
It's still in the area that the current Liberal law bans. So I mean, look, we believe that it's essential to get off the dependency on the U.S. market. Right now, we are beholden to the U.S. To a huge degree, especially when it comes to energy. So we absolutely believe that you can build a pipeline at the highest environmental standards with all the structural integrity and making sure you don't affect aquifers and things like that, with proper Indigenous consultation, as there was with Northern Gateway, where dozens of First Nations communities signed on to partnership agreements with the proposal. We also point out that it used to be in Canada that you didn't need tax dollars to build a pipeline. That used to be done by investors, but all that investment money is leaving. TC Energy, it used to be called TransCanada. They've dropped the Canada part of their name because they can't get anything built in this country. Just announced $8.5 billion worth of energy projects in the U.S. We believe those dollars should be being invested in Canada, and we're completely puzzled, not just puzzled, we're gobsmacked at Mark Carney's promise to Donald Trump that he would send $1 trillion of investment from Canada to the United States as part of some deal that they're working on. So we don't believe Canada needs to invest more dollars in the U.S. We believe Canada needs to invest, Canadian investors should be investing in Canada, putting Canadians to work, building Canadian factories, Canadian sawmills, things like that.
But even for example, when you use the example of Northern Gateway, like, even though a tanker ban didn't exist, ultimately Indigenous consultation was done. It was deemed to be not stringent enough, not adequate enough by a court. And even the way in which Cabinet made the decision was also part of what the court ultimately decided was not enough. So let's say, the Conservatives are in power, the tanker ban is removed. Is it really fair to say that these pipelines are all of a sudden going to get built. They simply didn't under Prime Minister Harper.
They did. There are 4 major pipeline projects, including to Tidewater. And what happened with the consultation piece was there's a very specific ruling by the judge about a very specific way the consultations were laid out, with a bit of a roadmap of how to do that. And rather than go back and do it properly, Justin Trudeau effectively vetoed that pipeline. And remember, Mark Carney was asked specifically when he was at committee, did he agree with Justin Trudeau's decision to kill the Northern Gateway project? And Mark Carney said yes. Mark Carney wrote a book called Values, where he complained that the carbon tax wasn't high enough, where he agreed, he advised Justin Trudeau when Justin Trudeau was phasing out the energy sector. So clearly Mark Carney's not going to get those big projects done. He hasn't included any talk of a pipeline in his so-called major projects list that hasn't actually even come into existence, still going from one bureaucracy to another. So what we're saying today is, look, let's get rid of the shipping ban. Let's let Canadian energy workers sell their products to Asian markets. Let's get a better return on what we are selling, so we're not just selling into the U.S. market. Let's let provinces like BC and Alberta and Saskatchewan collect more revenues. Let's let the federal government collect more revenues so we can improve services for Canadians. All Canadians benefit when Canada exports more of its energy. I never understand why radical politicians like David Eby are opposed to it, or Mark Carney for that matter.
Well, look, I understand the economic pitch, but I also understand there's nuances among the opposition, for example, along the coast of British Columbia, where they are very worried about the potential impact of exporting more oil from the coast. There are also First Nations who are supportive of a pipeline endeavor like that. But to say that it's that getting rid of the tanker ban, getting rid of the emissions cap is all of a sudden going to create a world in which the way you convey it is like, it's so simple. We could just build all this stuff. The fact is, you built some stuff under Prime Minister Harper. The major one was the Line 9 reversal. But I lived through that. I covered it living in Alberta. There was a ton of opposition. Even Keystone, approved under Harper. Why couldn't it get built? Because of opposition at the state level. Farmers in Nebraska, for example, who succeeded in court. So the idea that it's like these things that Trudeau did that made it untenable to develop the economy from a resource perspective, like, it's not substantiated by the facts.
But it actually is, Vashi. We had over 150, since the energy sector developed, we've had private sector proponents build pipelines in this country. I mean, I live in Regina, I can see where an Enbridge pipeline cuts across the north end of my city. That was all done by investors, Canadian investors, international investors, pouring money into Canada, putting Canadians to work. The shipping ban was a piece of legislation that Justin Trudeau imposed upon Canadians. He didn't have to do that. That was a marked change. The production cap, again, a government policy.
Then
what conservatives
oil
are
production
saying,
continue to rise under Trudeau so significantly, actually at a faster pace than the previous Prime Minister?
Because of the timelines and when he kicked in. But what he has basically said is that, what Justin Trudeau kind of set is that the Canadian energy sector cannot grow. And Mark Carney voted against repealing that production cap. So Mark Carney has said he's happy with that production cap. What conservatives are saying is that the roadblocks to pipelines are actually imposed by government. The shipping ban is a government decision. The production cap is a government decision. The industrial carbon tax, a government decision. These are all
feelings
things
of
that,
coastal First Nations, not a government decision.
But let's talk about all those First Nations community who wanted that project.
I agree. I acknowledge
that's where they get the economic benefit from. That's where their quality of life gets to improve. And I absolutely believe that everybody wins when our energy sector is able to thrive. First Nations community, oil and gas workers, provincial governments collecting revenues to improve public services. Like, where's Canada going to get the GDP growth? If the U.S. is effectively saying that Mark Carney is not going to get a deal on things like auto, if the U.S. is not dropping softwood lumber tariffs, and then this Liberal government comes along and says, oh yeah, we're also going to keep kneecapping our energy sector like Justin Trudeau is doing, where are we going to make up for these U.S. tariffs? Where is this growth going to come from? How are we going to get young Canadians back to work? Have you seen the job numbers for young Canadians in this country? The energy sector is a great avenue for young people to get good-paying jobs that allow them to start their lives.
The energy sector isn't on the decline. The energy sector under the previous Prime Minister grew on a monthly basis at twice the rate of Prime Minister Harper. I understand that the prospect of it getting way better is out there.
I will take you all over Saskatchewan and Alberta.
It's not contracting.
Sorry, I got to challenge you this. I will take you all over Saskatchewan and Alberta, and I will introduce you to people who lost their jobs. I'll show you people whose companies have gone bankrupt, and they had to watch American companies buy Canadian equipment at auction for pennies on the dollar. Okay, so you could find some stats that say that because of price changes, it might be better this month than last month, but there has been a real a real blow to the Canadian energy sector, and a lot of young people that would come out of high school, come out of the trades and say, okay, I'm going to go work in the energy sector. I'm going to go help drill. I'm going to get into, engineering and things like that. Those jobs have in many areas completely dried up. So these pipelines are not just an avenue to fill provincial coffers for healthcare and education. They're also a place where young people can get work again. And what we're questioning the government is, why not? What is this allergy to developing our energy sector? And why do Canadians have to pay the price? Why do those hardworking young Canadians have to pay the price for Mark Carney's radical ideology?
Do you have evidence, though, that this government thus far, and I take your point about his book and the positions he's espoused in the past, that thus far they are as anti-energy as you're painting them? The top project on their initial major projects list was LNG Canada Phase 2. And again, I'm not making up those statistics. I take your point about. That's from Macdonald Laurier Institute, and that's not exactly like a left-wing think tank. They did the analysis, and we know oil companies are making money hand over fist.
They're making money by investing in America. TC Energy, $8.5 billion.
They've switched to gas. They've moved off oil and onto gas.
They are building a pipeline in Virginia. They are. That is $8.5 billion of Canadian investment money that's going to work in the U.S. Those are Americans that are going to get those jobs, American steel workers, American construction workers that are going to do all that. All that money used to be put to work in Canada, and this government's not doing that. And as for evidence, it was just last week they voted against our motion to lift the production cap. That's pretty substantial evidence. In the last few weeks in Parliament, just across the street, they voted to keep Justin Trudeau's anti-energy policies.
Just quickly, though, you are also saying that you'll support Keystone if, in fact, that thing that's happening, in these negotiations that we don't really have any clarity on, like the Conservatives would essentially support that.
Well, we approved it back in 2010 under Stephen Harper. Donald Trump approved it in 2017. It was one of his first acts. This should be low-hanging fruit, by the way. Like, this shouldn't be hard. And if Donald Trump wants to buy our energy, he gets a good deal for the American economy. We shouldn't have to offer up anything in negotiations to get Donald Trump what he wants anyway. He's signaling to us that he wants it. He signed it off on it back in 2017. This should be done in a couple of hours if both parties are serious about it.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note. Mr. Scheer, appreciate your time as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, Andrew Scheer is the Conservative House Leader. Our front bench is here after a very short commercial break. We've got a lot to unpack on the subject of pipelines and, of course, that White House visit. Back in a moment with them.
Our job and our discussions are, okay, where can it be better? Where do we have an alignment of interests such that the two of us going together, three of us with Mexico, if it's under the USMCA rubric, and just as a parenthesis, but an important one, there's going to be, in my view, some bilateral deals, there already are, alongside USMCA. It's not an either or necessarily, and that's one of the realities of the negotiations.
That is Prime Minister Mark Carney just a few moments ago speaking virtually at the BMO Eurasia Summit in Toronto. He's being interviewed actually by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's former Principal Secretary, Jerry Butts. That's really the only kind of news out of what he said, that he expects there are some bilateral deals on the side, as we would kind of anticipate given the sectoral tariffs that exist. But other than that, it'll all fall to CUSMA. The Prime Minister has just returned from meeting U.S. President Donald Trump. The meeting ended on friendly, positive vibes, but fell short of any concrete announcement. Does that matter politically for the Prime Minister? Let's bring in our front bench. Sharon Carr is a CTV News political analyst. She's the former Deputy Chief of Staff to former Finance Minister Bill Morneau. Kevin Deagle is a Vice President at Crestview Strategy. He held senior roles in key portfolios in the Trudeau government, including at Natural Resources Canada. Jamie Ellerton, next to him, is the principal at Canaptus and worked for Minister Jason Kenney during the Harper government. And Sebastian Skamsky was former Director of Media Relations to Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. Hi, everybody. Very nice to see you. Okay, Sharon, I'm going to start with you. The back and forth in the House was really, really wild today. It was definitely the best exchanges I've seen since the House returned. There is a ton of pressure from the opposition on the Prime Minister to come back with something tangible. That didn't occur. Does it matter politically for him?
I think it's going to matter to a certain extent, but I think what everyone needs to remember is that this is not a normal negotiation. This is not normal diplomacy. We are dealing with Donald Trump, President Donald Trump is not a normal politician. Everything to him has to be done in a certain measured way. Do I think that the meeting in the U.S. was not successful? Absolutely not. I think tone and tenor is a big part of how that interaction happens. And we saw that the reaction and the conversations were pleasant. They were friendly, and they were not adversarial as we've seen in the past with Prime Minister Trudeau. Now, there's been a lot of talk about what's going to be give and take, and we just had Andrew Scheer on the show talking about Keystone XL, and I think that it's an interesting one to have President Trump raise Keystone XL. I got to push back on some of the commentary and the conversation he just had with you, Vashi, because sitting in a really interesting position here, having actually worked for TC Energy, crisscrossing Canada and the U.S., trying to get Keystone and Energy East built. It was the Harper government that we were kind of having to deal with, trying to get everything done. And it was the Harper government where we weren't able to get it done. And I think that his argument that the Liberal government has not done anything for the energy sector, I think is a bit of a revisionist history. The government did get TMX. I worked for the minister when we got TMX. I think it's not, we live in an environment
Save
that was...
the pipeline stuff for the second part of our discussion.
Fine. But what I will say is that from a win perspective for Prime Minister Carney, I will say from my perspective, having seen and been part of the first round of negotiations with Trump and his administration, I actually think it was a success in the sense that they didn't come out with anything catastrophic. People, though, politically are going to want to see little tidbits, but I think part of the negotiating strategy is not to be negotiating in public the way they have in the past.
Right. Jamie, I think Sharon hits at the key question, which is 6 months ago when we all breathed a collective sigh of relief at the degree to which there was, mutual respect shown between the Prime Minister and the President. That was then, right? Like, that seemed like a win to escape unscathed. Can the same lens be applied here all of these months later when in the interim, to be fair, like the Prime Minister did set out deadlines for himself and for his government that, they didn't end up meeting?
Yeah, actually, I think I would say two things to that. One, I don't think it's going to have massive political consequences for him, because when you look at public opinion polls, Canadians still overwhelmingly trust Prime Minister Carney to be the best person to deal with President Trump. And where Prime Minister Carney, is slipping in public opinion polls and having real challenges, it's on the domestic front and his lack of action in being able to get stuff done here back at home. And so on that front, I think is where he's going to continue to face more of an Achilles heel. I think Canadians generally are smart. And when you hear the opposition say you don't have a deal, like a lot of other countries don't have a deal, and when he talks about the fact that USMCA and our tariffs are lower than other jurisdictions, those are things that I think are ultimately going to resonate with the average Canadian. They're going to rally themselves and wrap themselves in the flag and agree and say why they don't like Donald Trump. I don't actually think Prime Minister Carney at this juncture pays the political price for it.
I'm going to move right over to your side to Kevin, who is nodding voraciously. I would guess that he agrees with you. I know Seb will probably have a different view. Kevin, what do you think?
Yeah, I really do agree with this. I think that Prime Minister Carney took a risk in going down to the Oval Office because we know what we would expect coming back without a deal. We expect the furor that we saw in the House of Commons today. And I give Mr. Poilievre a lot of credit. He's very good in his role as opposition leader, and he's doing his best to stay relevant. But what I wanted to see come out of this was to see Prime Minister Carney investing in the relationship, building trust on a bilateral degree with President Trump, which is what we saw. And that is a fundamental basis for us to move forwards, seek the concessions that we're looking to get, move forwards on the trade agreements that we're negotiating, and have that relationship be strong, be built on trust. And I think that's what we saw come out of the Oval Office.
Sebastian, your thoughts?
Well, I have to give, again, great credit to Prime Minister Carney for being so predictable. I think we did see him at his finest. He has gone down to yet another country, this time the United States, with returning really with not a lot, in fact, nothing, probably even worse than nothing. He has returned with the promise to America to invest $1 trillion into that country, which is staggering when you consider that in the last 6 months of his tenure as Prime Minister, Canada, the country which he governs, has lost $52 billion of investment, and I believe is 87,000 jobs. So the bar was set very low, it was actually non-existent, and he somehow managed to actually do the opposite of what we as Canadians had elected him to do. And it is, I think, begs the question, what is actually going on with these negotiations? He has set two deadlines for himself, both which have been missed. There has been, every concession has been made on behalf of Canada, with nothing in return from the state. So I'm really waiting and hoping to see some positive movement from Prime Minister Carney for the sake of Canada in the coming weeks and months.
I do want to circle back to Sharon and Jamie's point around the pipeline and the domestic aspect to this, because against the backdrop of what we just talked about with the United States, there's a lot of messaging from the government about, finding new markets, diversifying, all that kind of stuff. So we've got this pitch, Sharon, from Alberta's Premier. We had Premier Eby on to respond tonight. He is having none of it. It seems like, just like last week, it continues to be an even bigger political headache now for the federal government. Both parties are looking squarely at the Prime Minister to make a call. How much of a political vulnerability for him is that, potentially?
It can be a vulnerability, but I think what we see here is a time where we need the Prime Minister to kind of step up and say, we've got to all hold hands and sing Kumbaya again. We saw a moment of time where we finally had this period where there was this Canadian protectionist nationalism, where Donald Trump kind of made all the provinces say, you know what, we got to work together. We even heard Quebec not too long ago, Premier Legault say, social license might change and we might be able to do a pipeline through Quebec. We've seen this song and dance before, and I actually, in watching Premier Eby's commentary before this, I got to say, I don't think he is going to be winning any public relation battles when it comes to Canada as a whole here, because we can't stand up and say we got to fight Trump, and then immediately the second that Alberta wants to take product out to market, put our hands up and say, no, we've got to consult with this group. Of course, consultation needs to happen, but we are our own worst enemies if premiers are going to put their hands up and say, not through my backyard. And I got to say, as a Liberal who is extremely pro-energy sector, have worked on TMX, have worked on Energy East, have worked on Keystone, we are letting the opposition win a narrative when we actually have this inner fighting here. So I got to give Premier Smith credit, because she has said, you know what, we can't get proponents because proponents don't want to sink money into projects. And she said, you know what, we'll put in the $15 million, find more. Let's call the government's bluff. And the federal government has to look at it as a major project. And I think Premier Eby has to look at this then more than his provincial politics.
We haven't seen yet evidence, though, from, for example, the new energy minister, Tim Hodgson, Jamie, that he's willing to kind of stake a claim. He's like, well, they'll go through the process. They'll be like any other proponent.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason for that is because clearly the private sector has viewed Canadian government policy as too onerous to make it worthwhile to put their investment dollars into the country, which is why you do see the province of Alberta putting forth taxpayers' dollars to essentially seed the prospect of a project that was otherwise economical 10 years ago. And the only reason it's not today is because of government policy. I think when you look at the realities of the politics of this, we know Mark Carney's voter coalition is center-left, and a bit of the center-right. And he has an impossible balancing act as to how he's going to do that. And so how he sequences this fight and how he sequences the decision, he ultimately can't come down as looking like he's picking a side and having a clear winner and loser. He's going to have to create conditions, politically speaking, that gives Premier Eby somewhat of an off-ramp and enough of a timeline to neutralize, like you talked in your own interview with Premier Eby, that he faces a review vote. So maybe real movement on this isn't going to come until after that to allow him an off-ramp to save some face. And I think the politics of this are going to be what continues to be acrimonious. The Conservatives get to talk about how they're going to support this. They're right in that the federal government is responsible for these things, and that's where federal leadership can be. I think they're obviously talking to their political base predominantly in Alberta and Saskatchewan, as well as Canadians more broadly who, frankly, voted for Mark Carney thinking that we could work together as Canadians with our elbows up to push back what the Americans are doing. But the politics on this are going to continue to be quite fraught, and I don't envy Mark Carney having to navigate this, because I do think his whole premiership will sink or swim on it.
I have just a few minutes. I want to split it evenly between Kevin and Sebastian. Kevin, you worked on a bunch of these files, in particular at NRCan. Do you think there is a politically palatable solution the Prime Minister could offer?
You know, I always take a second to zoom out a little bit. And to me, what this seems like at this point is far more of a political play than an economic one. let's put $14 million into perspective. To get a pipeline like this done, it's not even enough to do the basic planning possible. And so this is, when I look at these ideas and projects, we look for a proponent, we look for the business case, but we don't have either of those at this point. We don't know what the route will be. We don't know what the Indigenous communities and partners will be. There's still so many question marks at this stage that I think before we get too far down this road, we need to start considering what is the actual business case here, what proponents will be stepping up, how real is this really? And keep in mind that both of these premiers are facing a bit of political pressure at home. Danielle Smith with the teachers' strike, and Premier Eby with potential rumblings of their political fortunes in the province. And so I think they're both happy to have an intense fight like this, but I always try to go back to the fundamentals of the private sector proponents and so on.
Last 30 seconds to you, Seb.
I mean, it's perplexing. I think I listened to the same interview that you gave, or you had with Mr. Eby, and it was really confounding. I don't understand what the purpose of hurting your own country is, your own province. Every one of his arguments seems conflicting with reality. And so I really do hope that common sense prevails, not to overuse that term. And like Sharon has said, we actually come together to get our resources to water, to export. Like, we cannot do this any other way if not through our ports. And so for whatever reasons, political or otherwise, I wish Mr. Eby well in his leadership review. If that's what it takes, and afterwards he can come and have some common sense to support this, I hope that happens. Until then, really cheering on Premier Smith and her efforts here, because the feds really got to get out of the way, and we got to get this pipeline built.
I got to leave it on that note. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Sebastian Skamsky, Kevin Deagle, Jamie Allerton, and Sharon Carr, our front bench. We're back in a moment. Your top headlines are just ahead. Thanks so much for watching Power Play tonight. See you tomorrow.